And now in this video, we're going to take a look at something we call intermolecular forces. Intermolecular forces are not the forces and not the bonds that hold molecules together, but rather they're the forces that will hold individual molecules to each other. And so, for instance, when we look at something like a molecule of water, so H2O, we have here the covalent bonds that actually hold the hydrogens to the oxygen. And so that's a legitimate bond made up of electrons covalently bonding the two atoms together. That is what we call an intramolecular force, holding the two of them, holding the atoms actually together. Now, if we have a whole bunch of water molecules, those are going to be attracted to each other and stay together through the intermolecular forces. And so that's our big difference between the two, is that an intramolecular force is going to be inside the molecule. It actually holds the molecule together. Whereas an intermolecular force is outside the molecule and it holds molecules to each other. And these forces end up arising from, how do I want to go there? So they end up arising from dipoles that are within a molecule. Now, these dipoles can either be temporary or permanent, as we're going to see in just a moment, but they're the same dipoles and the same polarity that we looked at when we looked at polarity in the last video. The first one to talk about is what we call dispersion forces, sometimes also called London forces. These are the only intermolecular force that is found and available in non-polar molecules. Essentially, what happens is there's a temporary dipole that happens in a molecule, a temporary polarity in the molecule that affects molecules around it. Actually, let's look at a better example of that. So here we go. So if we think of something like CH4, so here's a CH4 molecule here. Here's all the electrons that are in the molecule, just sort of randomly arranged inside that molecule. And so let's think about what happens. If CH4 is just by itself somewhere, then we've got all these electrons, and electrons, we haven't really talked about this in a lot of detail, but they're really always in random motion. When we talk about a bond in between two different atoms, yes, the electrons are pretty much there holding those two atoms together in our covalent bond, but they're also moving around all the time there, but they spend most of their time there making up that bond. So they're always moving around and they are shifting around the molecule, which makes it easy for us to picture that at some point, there's going to be more of them on one side of the molecule than another. That creates a very, very, very little bit of negatively charged buildup happening here on this one side. But then that disappears because of random motion. They're all moving around, jostling around. So we get this the next instant. But then again, it forms somewhere else. Just through random motion, they appear on another side of the molecule. And so again, due to random moment, for a brief moment, there's a bit of a partial negative buildup and a bit of a partial positive buildup on the other side. It goes away, but then it's formed again somewhere else. This is a temporary weak dipole. So a dipole, and I don't know if I actually used that term in the last video. A dipole is what exists when a molecule is polar, essentially. You get the charge buildup on one side of a molecule. But in this instance here with CH4, this is a temporary and weak dipole, which will just continue to form and then go away, form and go away. It just keeps happening and then going away again if there's no other molecules near it. If there is another molecule near it, though, let's picture 3 CH4 side by side. This middle one here, that temporary dipole forms, that's going to affect the molecules on either side. So the electron buildup on this side is going to repel the electrons here. The electron deficient partial positive here attracts the electrons in this molecule over towards it. And so then you end up basically kind of lining things up like that, and you get these regions that have a little bit of a negative charge and a little bit of a positive charge. That's going to end up holding the molecules together. That's a London dispersion force. London dispersion forces exist in all molecules. Their strength is going to be different depending on a variety of factors. For instance, more electrons will give you stronger London forces, and so larger molecules give you larger London forces, and so on. So that's our first intermolecular force to look at. We also have what we call an ion-induced dipole. So picture a molecule that is nonpolar. Picture a nonpolar molecule. If an ion gets near it, so a charged ion of some sort comes near it, that charged ion is going to cause the electrons in our nonpolar molecule to separate a little bit. And so our nonpolar molecule will respond to that charge. And then that will cause these two to stick together. This is something that has a pretty big physiological example in hemoglobin, which we talked about a little bit a while ago. Hemoglobin is the protein in red blood cells that's responsible for transporting oxygen. We have an iron atom in the middle of this metalloenzyme that binds the oxygen molecules. The way that it does that, so here's our heme group here. Here's our iron in the center. Here's our big protein. You can see that group here. And so what happens is this iron that's right in the center here is a charged iron atom. And what that does is that induces a dipole in an oxygen atom. And that causes an oxygen molecule, O2, and that causes that oxygen molecule to then stick to the heme group and allows hemoglobin to then transport oxygen around. Another type of intermolecular force is called the DipoleDipole Force. DipoleDipole forces will exist in molecules that have a net dipole, molecules that are polar. So remember what a polar molecule means is that one side of the molecule has a bit of a negative charge buildup. The other side has a bit of a positive charge buildup. And so if I have a molecule, for instance, like acetone here, that's what the shape of acetone looks like. And if I go through and look at my electronegativity differences, I find that there's a definite polarity in this molecule, goes in that direction. And so we have to remember that that means that this end of the molecule up here has a bit of a negative charge to it. It's kind of sort of a little bit negative. And then this end of the molecule down here ends up being a bit of a positive charge. And so this means that if there's another acetone in the same area, with its partial sort of negative charge here, that partial sort of negative charge of one is going to be attracted to the partial sort of negative charge of the other. That's a dipole-dipole interaction. The sort of positive side of one is attracted to the sort of negative side of another one. So that's a dipole-dipole interaction. There's also a special type of dipole-dipole interaction called hydrogen bonding. It's important to note that hydrogen bonding is not an actual bond, but it is called hydrogen bonding. It is the strongest of all intermolecular forces. Hydrogen bonding will exist if the polarity in a molecule is the result of hydrogen being directly bonded to nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine, and only then. And so in this case, in the example of water, here we have a hydrogen directly bonded to oxygen. We have two of them, in fact. And so water will exhibit hydrogen bonding. This compound here, this is propane, C3H8. We have carbon-carbon bonds and carbon-hydrogen. So we do have hydrogens in here, but they're directly bonded to carbon. They are not directly bonded to nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine. So this will not exhibit any hydrogen bonding. In fact, there are no electronegativity differences in here that are large enough to be polar at all. So this would be a completely non-polar molecule. So here's an example of what hydrogen bonding would look like with water. So we have our, remember, our covalent bond that holds oxygen to hydrogen. But then the partial sort of positive side of hydrogen is attracted to the partial sort of negative side of oxygen, forming a hydrogen bond interaction that would hold two water molecules together. And so just a couple things to look at here. Actually, it's not much I want to say on that slide. I also want to keep talking about hydrogen bonds a little bit. And so a hydrogen bond is about 2 to 4 times stronger than a normal dipole-dipole interaction. So it's a fairly strong interaction here. It's something that also plays a huge role in various biological instances. A great example is DNA. So hopefully you all remember from your basic biology that in DNA we have our sugar phosphate backbone here, but then we have base pairs in between that hold the whole thing together. So remember your pairs of adenine to thymine or guanine to cytosine, for instance. Those base pairs are held together with hydrogen bonds in the middle. And so this, I believe, we have adenine and thymine here. I might be getting those confused, but then cysteine and guanine. And so they're actually held together by hydrogen bonds in the middle. Now, again, think back to your basic biology. When DNA replicates, it has to split apart. Those base pairs have to be able to separate from each other. The advantage to them being held together with hydrogen bonds are that hydrogen bonds are strong enough to hold the whole thing together. However, when DNA has to unzip, those hydrogen bonds are not so strong that they can't be broken apart for DNA to separate in order to replicate. If they were held together with covalent bonds, then they're going to be held together way too tightly. They're not going to be able to actually separate for DNA to go through its replication. If it were just London forces holding them together, that's not enough to actually hold them together, and the whole thing's going to split apart. And so hydrogen bonding provides us this perfect in-between, this perfect medium type of force that's strong enough to hold DNA together, but not so strong that you can't rip it apart, that you can't break it apart when DNA has to replicate. Hydrogen bonding essentially is responsible for life as we know it. It's pretty cool. Intermolecular forces in general are responsible for things like the magnitude of boiling point and melting point. So if you think about it, remember, intermolecular forces are the forces that are holding compounds together. And so if there are stronger forces of attraction holding them together, it's going to be harder to take them apart. And that's essentially what melting and boiling is starting to take the molecules, starting to separate the molecules from each other. And so stronger forces, harder to take them apart, higher boiling points and higher melting points. Strength of intermolecular forces in general, London for everything else being equal. If you have two molecules that are about the same size, London forces are by far the weakest, dipole-dipole in the middle, and then finally hydrogen bonding is the strongest. And so if you have molecules that are similar size, a molecule that exhibits dipole-dipole interactions will have a higher boiling point than a molecule that exhibits only London forces. And that's important to note. And so we have some examples here. For instance, CH4 only has London forces, has a very, very low melting point, negative 182 degrees C. CH3F, so close to the same size. Now we have a dipole-dipole interaction. Now we have a melting point that's a little bit higher, negative 141. Methanol, CH3OH. Now we get some hydrogen bonding in there, even stronger. Now we're up to negative 93 for a melting point. And so those are all intermolecular forces. This is what I mean when we start to get up to intramolecular forces, though. In order to melt aluminum, now we've got a metallic bond holding these together. Look at that difference in melting point. Now it's going to take us 660 degrees to melt that. Aluminum fluoride. Now we have ionic bonds holding them together over 1200 degrees Celsius. Pure carbon. We have a pure diamond, pure graphite. Covalent bonds holding them together over 3000 degrees to melt that. And so there's our difference between intermolecular interactions and actually intramolecular bonding. Much, much, much stronger when we start talking about real bonding. And so in this, our last example here, just sort of looking at how this all comes together, 3 molecules that are close to the same size or so. We have ozone, O3, molecular weight of 48 AMU, only London forces, boiling point of negative 170 degrees C. Acetaldehyde, very similar molecular weight, very similar size, but now we have some dipole forces because of our carbon-oxygen bond here. Much higher boiling point at 20 degrees C now. But then water, much smaller than these other two. Much smaller molecule, only 18 AMUs, but the hydrogen bonding here is strong enough, and it's so much stronger in comparison, that now our boiling point jumps up to 100 degrees C. And so that ends our discussion of intermolecular forces. Hopefully you're starting to see how all this really ties together in a field like chemistry. In order to find out what intermolecular forces exist, you have to be able to draw the Lewis structure. You have to then consider the 3-dimensional shape of the molecule and how the polarity all fits in order to figure out what type of intermolecular attraction is going to exist. So there's a lot of steps there that you're going to have to be able to pull together to figure out what type of intermolecular attraction will exist there. And so that's all for today. And so as always, stay classy, USM.